Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Nyan Leadership Imposter Syndrome webinar series. This is our first installment in the webinar series. There's going to be 4 of them total, and each one is going to cover a different aspect of imposter syndrome or different scenario in which people might deal with imposter syndrome. So this is obviously for folks who are dealing with starting a new job or starting a new role in an organization, dealing with imposter syndrome. So if you or someone you know is dealing with this is a great webinar to share with them. First of all, thank you all to those of you who are attending live. I appreciate it. I'm going to make myself available in the chat. If you guys have questions, please feel free to type them in as you have them. There's not going to be a Q&A period at the end of the session. Normally, if there's a live webinar series, I do a Q&A session at the end. There's not going to have that this time. So I will be in the chat, though, answering questions on chat as you have them. So please do post in chat when you have questions or comments, those kind of things, and I'll do my best to respond as quickly as I can. So welcome to the series, like I said, and today we're talking about starting a new job. So first of all, let's talk about who I am, because some of you may know me, some of you don't. My name is Dhru Harlow, obviously, and I am the owner and founder of Nyan Leadership. I'm a business and executive coach. And so what I do is I help people primarily with mindset issues and leadership development, organizational development stuff within organizations, as well as business owners or whatever they're dealing with. But about 80% of what I do is mindset related. And that's why imposter syndrome is such a kind of a close to my heart situation. One is because I dealt with it for a very, very long time myself. And 2, because I know how debilitating it can be for folks who are dealing with it. So in my work, I deal with all kinds of mindset issues. And that's one of the things that I deal with on a regular basis. Another thing about Nyan leadership to know about is that Nyan means eyes. And it's actually my nephew's name as well. It means eyes in Hindi. And I named him because I like the name, but also I like the meaning behind it. Because ultimately, the more you can do things with it, the more you're aware of things, the more you can do things with them. You can't change anything you're not aware of. And so until you're aware of whatever issues there are, until you have self-awareness around whatever you're dealing with and what's underneath the surface, you can't do anything to change or affect that. And so you're going to be living with these kind of issues for potentially forever if you don't deal with them up front and be aware of them. So that's really what coaching is about, self-awareness. I'm also an artist, writer, photographer, serial entrepreneur, and creator in general. Everything that I do is somewhat related to creative arts of some sort, right? I love to create things. I think creativity and imagination is one of the most amazing things about being human, and one of the things we need to lean into a lot more. And so I try to focus on that as much as I can in whatever I do. Also, I'm a recovering attorney. I was a prosecutor for a period of time and no longer anymore, but I'm also a former IT consultant. So I've got a lot of different lenses within from which to look for things and look at things and situations that I've been trained to look at in certain ways. I've also been trained to shift my perspective as much as I can. I'm also a huge nerd. I love movies, love TV, I love comic books. And I also use those in my coaching and my work with clients because it helps them to see things from a different perspective as well. I'm also a huge dog enthusiast. That's my dog, Hachi. He's amazing. And he's also the namesake of my other company, Hachi Media, which is digital marketing and social media consulting. And then also I'm an explorer. That's me in Peekaboo Canyon in Utah. It's one of the things I love to do is explore the world and see what else is out there. Again, everything's about creativity, exploring perspective and seeing things from different points of view. And that was actually an amazing trip. So getting into what we're talking about today, what is imposter syndrome? How does it manifest? We're going to talk about that really in detail today and help you understand really where the genesis of imposter syndrome comes from, because you can't really deal with treating something until you understand how it comes about. And that's really where we're going to get to, is what the genesis of it and where it came from. We're also going to talk about the realities of a new role, right? And I say new role, not new job, because it might not be a new job. It might be a new situation, a new aspect of a new job you're taking on that may cause the imposter syndrome to kind of flare back up. You may get under control for a period of time, and then as soon as you take on new responsibilities or a new situation, it comes right back up and rears its ugly head. So we're going to talk about that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about understanding your fears and your inner voice and where that comes from. Obviously, this is a 30-minute session, so there's only so much we can talk about, and there's only so much that's generalized we can talk about. So if you do have anything that comes up for you specifically that you want to discuss, that might be a more specific situation customized to you, please do set up a one-to-one with me. We'll have a link at the end within which to do that. And I'd be happy to talk with you about how to deal with whatever you're dealing with on a very specific basis. Apologize. So this quote is something that I really love because it really tells you how deep imposter syndrome goes and how it just affects everyone. I've written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find me out now. Now, you might look at this and think of, this is probably someone not really famous, or someone that's, probably relatively unknown. But it's actually Maya Angelou. Right? Maya Angelou is one of the most famous and prolific poets that's ever written. I mean, especially modern day. And she's a phenomenal poet. If you haven't seen her work, please do look it up. It's really powerful and really moving. And she's an amazing poet, but she still has these thoughts. Even to this day, she's talked about it. And after having written 11 books, she still has imposter syndrome. She still has this mentality that, oh, people are going to find me out, that she's a fraud, that she's not as good as she thinks she is, or not as good as people think she is, right? That's how deep this can go. That's how much this can affect people and how long it can affect people if left unchecked. So what's the definition of imposter syndrome? And there's a technical definition we got from online, but the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. So you hear people talking about, oh, I'm just lucky. I'm really, really lucky. I'm lucky to have people around me. How lucky to do this, lucky to do that. Imposter syndrome is really, really sinister, or can be very sinister, because it kind of lurks underneath humility, right? There's some folks who are just they're humble, but then there's other people who use humility as a mask for imposter syndrome because they feel like, oh, I can't possibly take credit here, right? And there's a thin line between those two things. And we'll discuss it very briefly. But like I said, we're only scratching the surface today. There's only so much we can cover in 30 minutes. And so I want to make sure that we're giving enough time to whatever we're talking about. But that's something to think about, is that if you're talking about being humble, or you're talking to folks who are always very humble and just love sharing credit, right? That's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I think it's amazing. You have to share credit. You got to give recognition to people who deserve it and your team and who support you. At the same time, you can't be afraid to take some credit for yourself, because ultimately you're responsible for at least part of that success. And even if you're a manager of a team and the team does all the work, you're still the leader of that team. And the same way you take accountability when things go wrong, take some responsibility when things go right. So what are the common symptoms, right? Lack of confidence is the most obvious one, right? Deal with someone who has just really, really low self-esteem, really low confidence. That's one of the hallmark cases of imposter syndrome. But that by itself is not just a symbol of imposter syndrome, right? It doesn't mean that person has it. It just means that they may have it, okay? The other one is like kind of feeling like a fraud, right? Feeling like you might be discovered or exposed, like, oh my God, I can't believe, what if they find out, that I don't know what I'm doing, right? You don't feel like you know what you're doing, even though you may be really, really good, even though all the data points to the fact that you're amazing at what you do, you still just don't believe it, right? You're constantly on edge. What if people find out I don't know what I'm doing? What if I'm not as good as people think I am? What if, right? All the what ifs tend to pile up on you. And eventually they become, and they're all negative, by the way. There's no positive what ifs. I love that people never think of the positive what ifs, like as if only what ifs are bad, right? There's also positive what ifs as well. We don't ever talk about that or ever balance those things out. That's one way to talk about that. We'll discuss later, but that's something to think about, right? You're also extremely risk averse. You're always waiting for the axe to drop. You're waiting for, like, okay, well, any day I might just discover, so they're gonna let me go, right? And you're afraid of taking risks because you're like, oh, well, if I take a risk here, even if it's a calculated risk, you're still worried. You're still saying to yourself, if I take this risk and I'm wrong, right? Ignoring why you might be wrong, because there might be things you may not be able to control, but set that aside for a second. You're just thinking, if I'm wrong, if I'm wrong about this, if this goes wrong, right? Even if you're right and it goes wrong some other way, you're going to be, you're going to question your value, question everything. And you're worried that people might question you. They might question your knowledge, your expertise, your qualifications, and what you bring to the table. Now, if you think about this at its core, that fear is like, I want to take care. I want to make sure that I'm safe, right? I gotta stay safe, so I can't possibly take a risk here. But when you take that and extrapolate it to its logical conclusion, what ends up happening? Well, because you don't speak up, because you don't ever take any risks, right? People don't believe what you're saying anymore because they don't never say anything, right? All that happens is you don't speak up, you don't advocate for yourself, and you don't trust yourself or your instincts. And then people start seeing that about you, and then they don't trust you either, because they're like, oh, this person doesn't have confidence in themselves. If they don't have confidence in themselves and they're not willing to speak up, then how can I have confidence in them? They don't trust you because you don't trust you. And then what ends up happening? Is you actually end up screwing yourself over anyway. And you end up getting laid off or getting passed over for promotions because they don't have faith in you, because you don't have faith in yourself. And so the same thing that you were afraid of, the thing you were afraid of in the beginning and trying to protect yourself from, is what you end up causing anyway. Isn't that funny how that happens? So what's actually happening here, though, right? Well, let's talk about what caused the imposter syndrome, right? So you have the world, and then you have your view of the world.
right? Now, between those things, there's context. And that context can be different for whatever you're talking about, right? So this is what I call contextual identity, right? So your contextual identity is different depending on what situation you're in. With your family, you may have certain activities, certain habits, certain behaviors, certain way of speaking, and a certain way of thinking, right? With your work, you may have a totally different way of operating, but you're still you, but just the way you operate may be a little bit different or a lot different, right? With your friends, you may be different than both of those. And then as you go into different circles, different situations, little different aspects of you may come out in different ways. That's your context. Those are your contextual identities, right? They're multiple ones. And so you shift it a little bit depending on what you're going on, what you're doing, who you're interacting with, to make sure that you're actually, integrating properly into that. That's a mechanism that we operate with for survival, right? We adapt as much as we can. Not that it's incongruent or not consistent with who we are. Sometimes it isn't, but most of the times it at least a part of that is who we are still, right? Then you have your absolute identity, right? That's the part of you that doesn't change. Those are your morals, your values, the things that make up your core, right? It's not anything that can be taken away from you. That's the stuff that is who you are when you're by yourself or with your dog or cat, right? Because studies have shown, which is kind of funny, studies have shown that we actually don't really have shame in front of our dogs or cats, in front of our pets. A lot of times, most people don't. We just are who we are. We'll dance, we'll do stupid stuff, we'll sing to our dogs, we'll sing to our cats, we'll be really, really stupid and funny and goofy with our pets, even though we might be really normal with everybody else. And I use the word normal very loosely, obviously. But that's kind of who we are at our core. We are that sum of things, that sum of values, morals, beliefs, stories of the world, right? And that can't be taken away by anything, right? Context can go away. Your job can change. So that contextual identity now doesn't exist anymore. And you have a new one for your new job. Your absolute identity is not going to change. That's never going to change, right? But now both of these identities act as a filter, right? So you have information that comes in from the world, right? And now you have a story about that information. And that story is the meaning you make of that information as it comes through your different identities. So that goes back and forth, right? Between the world and between you. As you communicate to the world, it's also filtered through your identities. It's also filtered through how you see the world, right? And then it goes through the absolute identity as another filter, right? So everything you go back and forth, it's filtered back and forth, right? Both ways it gets filtered. Now, the analogy I love to look at is the fish in the water, right? If you ask a fish, how's the water? What are they going to say? They're going to ask you a question back. They're going to say, what water? Because guess what? The fish doesn't realize it's in water. That's the whole world the fish knows. The fish doesn't know there's a world outside of that water, because if it goes outside of the water for too long, it dies, right? And its natural habitat is not to live outside the water. So when you ask the fish that question, they don't know anything else but that water. We're all living in our own little fish bowls, right? Our own little worlds. Our identities are things that filter through things for good or bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It sounds like it's a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's meaning making of the world, right? It's sitting there saying, okay, here's how we make the meaning of the world so we can continue to survive and grow and build ourselves up and be safe in the world, right? Because safety is also extremely important. Thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, safety is right there in the bottom as one of the foundational things, right? So that's something we're going to try to preserve at all costs. And now we think about the imposter, right? The imposter within all of us, the one that makes us question ourselves all the time and makes us doubt ourselves. People think that we're self-sabotaging, or that's ended up happening, that we're like hurting ourselves, right? Well, the results may be hurting us, but we're not hurting ourselves directly. The imposter is literally just a misalignment of our identities, right? It's just us saying, the internal absolute identity saying, hey, listen, I'm not really comfortable in this environment, so I'm going to go back to what I know. And what I know doesn't really add up to whatever we need to do in this world. So maybe just stay safe and don't do what this new thing is over here, right? This new skill, this new role, whatever that is. The imposter is trying to protect you. At its core, that's really what it's trying to do. It's trying to say, you know what? Be really careful. Just be careful, all right? And you know what? Actually be abundantly careful. Be so careful you don't even do anything. Just stay in your bubble, all right? Just stay where you're comfortable, because I know that I can keep you safe there. And outside of that bubble, I can't keep you safe. I can't promise you're going to be totally safe. So in order to address the imposter, in order to really deal with that, you have to work on your absolute identity. You have to really say, and intentionally, I'm going to try to grow my absolute identity. And that's the only thing that can happen with the absolute identity. You can only change that intentionally. If you invest in some kind of self-awareness,
and really say to yourself, I want to get to know what my actual values are, what my actual beliefs are, what's at the core of me. Before you have to know that first before you're able to change it. And that can only be changed intentionally through actual work on yourself. And that's why it's so difficult to deal with the imposter. That's why sometimes people never actually deal with it. They just they just try to manage it as much as they can for their whole lives. Some people's voices are louder than others, right? Some people's imposters are so loud that they end up turning to alcoholism or drug abuse or things like that, right? Because they've got to cope with whatever's going on. And that's not the only reason that they deal with that. But that's one reason, just to kind of silence the voices, to silence the doubt, and to just say, I'm just going to do what I want to do. There's a reason it's called liquid courage, right? Because it helps you kind of silence that voice that worries about you. But ultimately, that voice is worried about you for a reason. So let's set that aside for a second, and let's look at the reality of a new role, all right? Before we jump into the depth of actually how to deal with imposter, let's talk about the new roles, right? It's a new environment, right? Whether you're in the same organization or not, maybe you already know some people in the new team. That's great, but the new role involves new situations that you're dealing with, new responsibilities, right? As you're dealing with those new responsibilities and new situations, that's going to be a little uncomfortable for you, right? You're going to be incredible new people, maybe, right? And the new role, as you're working through different things, there's not going to be the same people that you've always dealt with, unless the new role involves the same people, in which case you still have the imposter syndrome from last time. It may be a little weaker, maybe something that you've already learned how to deal with, in which case that's great. But when you're talking about a new role, a totally new role, these are the kind of things you have to worry about, right? And then when you're in a new situation, a new environment, new people, new role, you're going to want to prove yourself. You want to be able to say, hey, listen, you made the right choice by selecting me. So I'm going to demonstrate my value. I'm going to do everything I can to prove to you that you made the right choice by selecting me for this role, because I'm going to do it. I know how to do it, right? That's pressure. And now you can even say that in the back of your head, but then you got another voice that's probably a lot stronger to saying like, hey, be careful. Do you sure you know what you're doing? Are you sure you can demonstrate value here? Because we haven't done this before. Or if we have done it before, we haven't done this here before. Or if we have done this here before, we haven't done this in this particular context before. And the imposter is really good at the creating the negative what ifs, right? It's like it's always the worst case scenario. Like, what if this happens? What if that happens? So be careful. Be really worried about this. Like this is gonna hurt if you don't do it the right way. So we got to be really careful here, right? That's really good at that. So you got to understand also the growth is uncomfortable, and it's gonna be uncomfortable as we go through this process, right? And those are the realities of a new role. And as you're walking into this new role, it may not always be imposter syndrome that you're dealing with. So keep that in mind as well. That's why this part of the conversation is important, because anyone going to a new role is going to have some level of discomfort, right? Because you're growing. And just because you're going through some discomfort and your voice is telling you, hey, be careful, that doesn't always mean it's an imposter syndrome. It could just be you taking care of yourself and saying, hey, this, let me tread carefully here. But if the voice is really loud and just becomes debilitating and kind of affects how you do the work, it goes from proving yourself to actually really disproving yourself. And that's where imposter syndrome comes in. So let's do a little activity now, okay? For those of you who are watching this or listening in on this, if you are driving or doing anything that requires you to, focus on what you're doing, I would say stop the recording now and do what you're doing and come back to this later, because this involves you kind of really going through a visualization exercise and involving you kind of really focusing on what we're talking about. Not kind of, but really focusing on what we're talking about. I do not want anyone to have any injuries or anything like that. So if this is involving you driving, operating in heavy machinery, anything that requires your focus, please focus on that. Don't do this right now. Stop the recording, come back later, and we'll deal with this later. But for those of you who are still here and who are actually able to watch this and able to focus right now, I would invite you to close your eyes and take a moment to just focus. All right, this is going to be a little bit of a mindfulness exercise. So if that makes you a little uncomfortable, just letting you know that's what's going to happen right now. So if you want to skip ahead, that's fine, but you will miss a pretty important exercise that really helps you kind of pinpoint stuff for yourself. So for those of you who are willing to close your eyes, please feel free to do so now. And take a deep breath in with me for a count of 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it for 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And out through your mouth for 4, 3, 2, 1. Inhale again through your nose. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it for 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and out for 4, 3, 2, 1. Now I want you to keep your count on your own. Keep breathing as deeply as you can and holding it for a period of time and letting it out relatively quickly through your mouth. Now I want you to, as you're breathing, think about what happens when you hold yourself back. Think about what happens when you doubt yourself. Think about the thoughts that you have. What message is in those thoughts? Get really clear. I mean, get to the point where you can actually almost hear the thoughts, hear the words coming at you. All right. Now, when you can hear those words, when you can hear the thoughts being articulated to you, set that aside for one moment and think about a friend or family member, someone you know that cares about you, that really wants the best for you. They really want to help you, but they're so freaking annoying. They're annoying as hell. I mean, like super annoying, right? They're just nagging you all the time. They're a good person at their heart and they really care about you. They want the best for you, but they have no idea how to help you. They have no idea what you're capable of, and they just want to protect you at all costs. They're going to give you advice. They're going to try to give you advice, whether you ask for it or not. They're going to try to give you advice. And that advice is going to be based on their experience, their world, and the way they perceive the world. Speaking of identities, it's going to be advice through their identity lenses, not through yours. Now, I want you to really hear this person's voice in your head and think about what their name is. You don't have to say it to me. Obviously, you can't say it to me. If you feel comfortable, put it in the chat, put the name in the chat. But if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. Just know the name for yourself. Now, I want you to give your imposter that name. Hear those thoughts, the imposter's thoughts, all the doubts, all the tearing down, like the be careful, be careful, be careful. You can't do this. What if they find out? They're not going to know who you are. They're not going to, respect you because you don't know what you think you know. Hear all those words, all those thoughts in that person's voice. And think about how you deal with that person when they tell you those annoying ass things. When they won't stop talking to you about stuff and giving you advice that they know nothing about. Visualize them saying those things to you. How do you deal with that person in real life? If you ignore them, that's one way to deal with it, but it's not really the most effective way. Now, if you tell them, hey, listen, shut up, I got this, okay? Relax. I know what I'm doing here. You really don't. Let me deal with this my way. Let me do this because I know what I'm doing. Personally, I think about my mom. Love her to death. Love her beyond death. But she has no idea how to actually give me advice on things. Sometimes. Some advice is amazing, don't get me wrong. But regarding most things that I deal with, she doesn't know how to help me. But she only knows it through her lens. So she's going to give me advice through her lens. And that's what these people are doing. That's what the imposter is doing. The imposter is a portion of you, a part of you that wants to stay safe all the time. And so they are going to keep you safe, even at the cost of holding you back. But they're not going to see the holding you back part. They're only going to see the safety part. And so they're going to say, hey, I kept you safe. I did my job. But they don't know how to help you grow. And they don't realize that growth is uncomfortable. Growth does involve risk. And so you have to tell them, you have to advise them, listen, hey, I got this, okay? If it's a friend of yours, tell them, hey, listen, shut up, I got this, okay? Don't worry about it. You just do your thing, I'll do my thing. Now, tell me how that feels as you're thinking about that. Feel free to open your eyes now and tell me what that feels like. If you want to put it in the chat, feel free. But at least articulate to yourself how that feels to you. When you add that voice, make that person that imposter sound like that person that you know how to deal with, because it is the same situation almost. That's how you deal with that imposter. You silence it by telling it to be quiet, relax. Because again, it's not coming from a place of trying to hurt you. It's not coming from a place of trying to tear you down. It's not trying to affect you in a negative way. It's trying to help you. It just has no real idea of how to do that. And so it's doing it the only way it knows how. All right. Post in the chat. Let me know how that feels, how that works for you, if that works or not. Let's recap real quick. Talk about this real quick. So how do you deal with the imposter? Understand who the imposter is. The imposter is still you. At the end of the day, it's not some external evil thing. It's not a demon. It's not any of that nonsense. It's part of you. It's just the really risk-averse, scared part of you, right? It created rules to operate that you've outgrown decades ago, probably. And those rules are what it's still operating under. Think about your mom telling you not to touch the hot stove. Well, that rule in your head now, oh, okay, as a 40-year-old, all stoves are hot. Don't touch a stove. But fast forward to 25, are you still not going to touch the stove because you think it's all stoves are hot all the time? No. We create simple rules to operate when we're in simpler minds as a kid or whatever, because it's just easier. But unfortunately, we don't prepare ourselves for the future by doing that. So as we grow, we have to adapt. And that part of ourselves is not adapted. Why? Why is the imposter? Why does it exist? It exists to protect you, to keep you safe, right? But the problem is it's operating out of fear, not out of desire or goals. You need to operate out of goals. What do you want? Go after that thing. It's saying, what do I want to avoid? Stay away from that thing. There's a distinction there. And it doesn't care if you achieve what you want or not. It's as long as you're avoiding pain. That's what the imposter's goal is, to avoid pain. And so it's going to try to protect you that way as much as it can. Again, even at your detriment. Separate you from your imposter. That's the whole exercise we just went through, right? You're giving it that name of that friend or family member who's really, really, really good person. They really mean well. They care about you deeply, but they have no freaking clue how to help you. And so they're giving you really bad advice, which is to stay safe and don't do anything at all. Stay safe, good advice, but don't do anything at all. Don't take any risks at all. Don't assert yourself. They might find out you suck. That's not helpful, right? Because ultimately you probably don't suck. Most imposter syndrome, most people who suffer from imposter syndrome are actually pretty high achievers. They're good at what they do. They know what they're doing, but they have the doubt because they have really high standards for themselves and they also want to keep themselves safe. They've achieved whatever they want, that amazing accolades that they have, but those accolades don't mean anything because they still don't reinforce and deal with the imposter who's still trying to keep you safe. So naming it definitely helps. Externalizing your imposter definitely helps, and pushing and then push forward from there. And obviously it takes time and reinforcement. It takes practice as well. Doing it one time is not going to solve anything. This session here today is not going to solve anything. It's going to help you deal with it ultimately, but it won't necessarily solve the problem long term. You have to reinforce and keep building on that. Okay. And that's work you can do with a friend, a family member, a therapist, or a coach. If they're experiencing that, that's work you can do with those folks. So what now? Well, understand and remind yourself of the considerations around the new role. Remember, just because you have some doubts about yourself or because you're dealing with stuff that might be tough, doesn't mean you're dealing with imposter syndrome. It doesn't mean that that's automatically what that is. All right. So don't just fall into that trap. You don't always have a certified condition, right? Focus on building trust and strong relationships with your peers, your managers, and your subordinates. People in your new role, people in the new organization you're joining, focus on building those strong relationships with them. Make sure that they know you, like you, and trust you. So that even if you do make a mistake, imposter syndrome aside, even if you make a mistake, they know what you're capable of. They know who you are. And they know you're not doing that because you're incompetent. You're doing that because you're human, because that's what you are, ideally. I don't know, assuming here. And then understand the goal of your imposter. The goal of your imposter is to keep you safe at all costs, including your growth, right? And where it's coming from. Last is name it and deal with it accordingly. Externalize it, get it out of you, because it is part of you, but it's not part of your growth plan. So externalize it, accept that it is part of you, but then externalize it in terms of dealing with it and deal with it the way you would anything else. All right. And that is presentation today. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. We are going to, again, have more of these. This is the first session in a 4-part webinar series. So please do hit the QR code at the top if you want to schedule one-on-one with me to talk more in detail about what you're dealing with. And otherwise, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. Take care. Stay safe. I'm here always if you have questions. And yeah, be safe, everyone.